If you've ever wondered how one city could become the stage for 10 years of war, countless heroes, meddling gods, and one very suspicious wooden horse, then you've come to the right place. But don't worry, we're not rushing into battle just yet. Tonight, we're telling the story slowly, like a lullaby stretched across centuries. Troy was no ordinary city. It stood proudly on the coast of Asia Minor, its walls tall and gleaming, its gates strong, its people proud. To the Greeks, Troy was both a rival and a mystery, a place of wealth, power, and destiny. And yet, for all its strength, Troy would one day fall, not to swords alone, but to trickery, passion, and the stubbornness of gods and men. The legend of Troy begins not with fire, but with whispers. Whispers of beauty, of prophecy, of choices that seemed small but would ripple into history. Before the clash of armies, before Achilles sulked in his tent, before Hector faced his fate, there was simply a city, a queen, and a story waiting to unfold. And so, we start here, Tom, steady, and perhaps a little boring, the perfect pace for a bedtime history. The walls of Troy are still standing. The ships of Greece are not yet sailing. Helen is still in Sparta. Paris is still a shepherd. The gods are still plotting. Everything is quiet, for now. But make no mistake, this quiet will not last. The legend of Troy is about to awaken, and once it does, it will carry us through 20 chapters of passion, prophecy, and war. Like and subscribe, and let me know in the comments from where you're watching. Unless you're tuning in from inside a suspiciously large wooden horse, in which case, please stop commenting and start creaking softly. In the royal halls of Troy, Queen Hecuba carried a child within her. Yet before his birth, she was troubled by a dream so vivid it could not be ignored. In her vision, she gave birth not to a baby, but to a blazing torch. The flame spread, consuming the city, its walls crumbling in the fire. When the dream was told to the seers, their interpretation was grim. They declared that the child she carried would one day bring about the destruction of Troy. This was no ordinary prophecy. It was a warning that the fate of the entire city rested upon the life of one unborn child. King Priam, shaken by the prophecy, faced a terrible choice. When the boy was born, he ordered that the infant be taken away, abandoned on the slopes of Mount Ida, left to die so that Troy might be spared. It was a cruel act, but one born of fear. Yet fate is rarely so easily denied. The infant was discovered by shepherds, who took pity on him. They raised him among their flocks, giving him a simple life far from the palace. The boy grew strong and handsome, unaware of the prophecy that hung over him, unaware of the royal blood that flowed in his veins. This child was Paris. To those around him, he was merely a shepherd, gentle and charming, tending sheep and living quietly. But destiny had already marked him. The dream of the flaming torch lingered. And though Troy's walls stood tall and its people thrived, the shadow of the prophecy remained. Paris's life seemed peaceful, but the gods were watching. They knew that one day this shepherd boy would make choices that would ignite a war, choices that would fulfill the prophecy and bring Troy to ruin. For now, he lived in innocence, but the torch of fate was already burning, waiting for its moment to blaze. Far away from the quiet hills where Paris tended his sheep, the gods themselves were preparing the stage for the war to come. It began with something deceptively small, a single golden apple. The story tells that all the gods were gathered for a grand wedding feast, the marriage of Peleus and Thetis. Every Olympian was invited, except one, Eris, the goddess of strife. She was not welcome, for wherever she went, quarrels followed. But Eris was not one to be ignored. She arrived anyway, carrying with her a gift that was no gift at all. It was a golden apple, shining and perfect, inscribed with the words, knowing full well that such a prize would spark jealousy. Immediately, 3 goddesses claimed it: Hera, queen of the gods; Athena, goddess of wisdom and war; and Aphrodite, goddess of love and beauty. Each believed herself the fairest. Each refused to yield, and soon the feast turned into a quarrel. The dispute grew so heated that even Zeus refused to judge between them. He knew that choosing one would anger the other 2, and even the king of the gods preferred not to face that storm. Instead, he decided that the choice should be made by someone else, someone mortal, someone far removed from Olympus. And so, the golden apple was carried down to the hills of Mount Ida, where Paris lived as a shepherd. The gods had chosen him, the boy once abandoned, the boy raised in simplicity, to decide which goddess was the fairest. The apple of discord had done its work. A single act of spite had set in motion a chain of events that would lead to jealousy, passion, and war. The gods had quarreled, and now a mortal would be drawn into their conflict. The torch of prophecy flickered brighter, and Troy's fate moved one step closer to its doom. The quarrel among the goddesses over the golden apple could not be resolved on Olympus. Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite each claimed the title of fairest, and none would yield. Zeus, wise enough to avoid their wrath, chose not to decide himself. Instead, he declared that a mortal should judge someone far removed from the politics of the gods, someone whose choice would seem impartial. That mortal was Paris, the shepherd prince of Troy, still unaware of his royal blood. One day, as he tended his flocks on Mount Ida, he was approached by Hermes, the messenger of the gods. Hermes explained that Paris had been chosen to settle the dispute. It was a strange honor and a dangerous one, for to choose one goddess meant offending the other 2. The 3 goddesses appeared before him, each radiant in her own way. Hera, queen of the gods, promised Paris power and dominion. She offered him the rule of great kingdoms, the authority to command men, and the glory of kingship. Athena, goddess of wisdom and war, promised him unmatched skill in battle, victory in every fight, and the wisdom to lead with brilliance. Aphrodite, goddess of love and beauty, offered something different, the heart of the most beautiful woman in the world. Paris listened, weighed their promises, and made his choice. He gave the golden apple to Aphrodite. In that moment, he sealed his fate and the fate of Troy. For the most beautiful woman in the world was Helen, queen of Sparta, already married to King Menelaus. The gods accepted his judgment, but the consequences were immense. Hera and Athena, insulted and enraged, became enemies of Troy. Aphrodite, delighted, became Paris's ally, guiding him toward Helen. The prophecy of Hecuba's dream moved closer to fulfillment. Paris returned to his quiet life, but the decision he had made was no small matter. It was the spark that would ignite a war, the choice that would bring heroes across the sea, and the moment when the torch of destiny burned brighter than ever. Helen was said to be the most beautiful woman in the world, a daughter of Zeus and Leda, born from a union that itself carried the strangeness of myth. Her beauty was not ordinary. Poets described it as radiant, irresistible, and dangerous. Wherever Helen went, admiration followed, and with admiration came envy, desire, and conflict. When she came of age, suitors from across Greece gathered to seek her hand. Kings, princes, and heroes all wished to marry her, each eager to claim the honor of being her husband. The competition was fierce, and her stepfather, Tyndareus, feared that choosing one suitor would lead to quarrels among the rest. To prevent bloodshed, he devised a clever solution. Every suitor would swear an oath to defend the chosen husband if ever his marriage was threatened. This oath, seemingly harmless at the time, would later bind all of Greece to the war against Troy. Helen's husband was Menelaus, king of Sparta. He was wealthy, powerful, and brother to Agamemnon, the mighty king of Mycenae. Their marriage brought stability, and Helen became queen of Sparta, ruling beside Menelaus in a palace filled with riches. Yet beauty such as hers was never free of danger. The gods themselves had already marked her as a prize in their quarrel. When Paris awarded the golden apple to Aphrodite, the goddess promised him Helen's love. Though Helen was married, fate had already begun to weave its threads. For now, Helen lived in Sparta, admired by her people, honored as queen. But destiny was moving quietly toward her. Soon, Paris would arrive, guided by Aphrodite, and the oath of the suitors would be tested. The peace of Sparta was fragile, and the beauty of Helen was about to ignite a war that would echo through the ages. Paris, now grown into a handsome man, lived peacefully among the shepherds of Mount Ida. Yet his destiny could not remain hidden forever. Guided by Aphrodite, who had promised him the love of the most beautiful woman in the world, Paris was drawn toward Sparta, where Helen lived as queen beside her husband, King Menelaus. When Paris arrived in Sparta, he was welcomed as a guest. Hospitality was sacred in the ancient world, and Menelaus treated him with honor, offering food, shelter, and friendship. For a time, Paris lived in the palace, surrounded by wealth and splendor far beyond the shepherd's life he had known. But Aphrodite's promise lingered. Helen, radiant and admired by all, became the focus of Paris's desire. Accounts differ on what happened next. Some say Helen was enchanted by Aphrodite's influence and left willingly with Paris. Others claim Paris abducted her, stealing her away from her husband. Whatever the truth, the result was the same. Helen departed Sparta and sailed with Paris to Troy. When Menelaus discovered that his guest had betrayed him, his fury was boundless. The sacred laws of hospitality had been broken, his marriage shattered, and his honor insulted. He turned at once to the oath sworn years before by Helen's suitors. Every king and hero who had once sought her hand was now bound to defend Menelaus's marriage. Paris returned to Troy with Helen, and the city welcomed her as a prize. Yet beneath the celebration, the shadow of prophecy grew darker. The torch of Hecuba's dream flickered brighter, for the act of taking Helen would summon armies across the sea. The quiet life Paris had once known was gone, replaced by a destiny that would bring ruin to his people. When Menelaus discovered that Helen had been taken to Troy, his anger was not his alone. Years earlier, when Helen was still a maiden and suitors from across Greece had gathered to win her hand, her stepfather, Tyndareus, had faced a dilemma. Choosing one suitor meant offending all the others, and the rivalries could have torn Greece apart before Helen's marriage even began. To prevent bloodshed, Tyndareus devised a clever solution. He required every suitor to swear a solemn oath. No matter who won Helen, the rest would defend that marriage if ever it was threatened. Bound by honor and by the gods, the suitors agreed. It was a promise that seemed harmless at the time, but it would one day summon kings and heroes into a war that would last a decade. Now, with Helen gone, Menelaus called upon that oath. He demanded that all who had once sought her hand fulfill their promise. Across Greece, messengers carried the call, and rulers answered. Agamemnon, Menelaus's brother, brought the vast power of Mycenae. Odysseus of Ithaca, reluctant but bound, joined the cause. Ajax, Diomedes, Nestor, and many others gathered. Even Achilles, the young warrior destined for glory, was summoned. The oath united them, not out of love for Menelaus, but out of duty to their word. Together they formed a great alliance, a host of ships and soldiers unlike any Greece had ever seen. The quarrel of goddesses, the choice of Paris, the abduction of Helen, all these threads now wove together into a single tapestry of war. The kings of Greece prepared to sail, bound by the oath of Tyndareus, bound by honor and bound by destiny. The torch of prophecy burned brighter, and Troy's fate drew nearer. The call to arms spread across Greece, and the oath of Tyndareus bound kings and heroes alike. From every corner of the land, warriors gathered, ships were prepared, and supplies were loaded. The alliance was vast, a fleet so large that poets later claimed it numbered more than 1,000 ships. Yet assembling such an army was no simple task. The gods, as always, demanded their share of reverence. Agamemnon, commander of the host, offended Artemis by boasting too proudly of his skill in hunting. The goddess, angered, stilled the winds, leaving the fleet stranded in harbor. Days passed, and the soldiers grew restless. To appease Artemis, Agamemnon was told he must sacrifice his daughter, Iphigenia. The decision was cruel, but without it, the ships could not sail. In some tellings, Artemis spared the girl at the last moment, whisking her away. But the shadow of that sacrifice lingered over the army. At last, the winds rose, and the fleet set out across the sea. The sight was awe-inspiring. Countless sails stretched across the horizon, oars beating in rhythm, warriors singing of glory and vengeance. Each ship carried men bound by the oath, each man ready to fight for Helen and for honor. The journey was long, and storms tested their resolve. Some ships were scattered, some delayed, but the alliance pressed onward. The sea carried them toward Asia Minor, toward the shining walls of Troy, for the Trojans. The horizon would soon darken with sails. For the Greeks, the war they had sworn to fight was about to begin. The torch of prophecy burned brighter, carried now across the waters, as the greatest alliance Greece had ever known sailed toward destiny. While the Greek alliance gathered its ships and set sail across the sea, the city of Troy began to prepare for the storm that was coming. Word of Helen's arrival spread quickly through the streets. To some, she was a prize, proof of Paris's boldness and Aphrodite's favor. To others, she was a dangerous omen, a woman whose beauty had already stirred the wrath of Greece. King Priam, wise and aged, listened to the voices of his people. He knew the prophecy that had haunted Paris since birth, and he understood that the Greeks would not let this insult pass unanswered. Still, he stood by his son, unwilling to abandon him, unwilling to surrender Helen. The Trojans strengthened their defenses. The walls of Troy, already famed for their height and strength, were inspected and fortified. Gates were reinforced, towers manned, and weapons prepared. The city's warriors, Hector, noble and steadfast, Aeneas, destined for future greatness, and many others readied themselves for battle. Inside the palace, the royal family gathered. Priam counseled caution, Hector urged vigilance, and Paris defended his choice, insisting that Aphrodite herself had promised him Helen. The gods, unseen but ever present, watched with interest, each choosing sides in the conflict to come. Beyond the walls, the people of Troy carried on with their lives, but unease lingered. Merchants whispered of fleets crossing the sea, mothers worried for their sons, and priests offered sacrifices to appease the gods. The city was proud, but it was not blind. The Greeks were coming, and the war that had been foretold was drawing near. Thus Troy prepared itself, a city bracing for a siege, a people standing behind their prince, and a fate already written in prophecy. The torch of destiny burned brighter, and the quiet before the storm grew heavy with expectation. The Greek fleet finally reached the shores near Troy, their sails filling the horizon, their warriors eager for battle. The Trojans, watching from their walls, saw the sea darken with ships and knew the war had begun. The first years of the conflict were not the grand duels sung by poets, but long, grinding struggles. The Greeks landed and built camps along the coast, raiding nearby towns and villages to secure food and supplies. These smaller battles weakened Troy's allies, but the city itself remained strong, its walls unbroken, its defenders resolute. The Trojans fought fiercely under the command of Hector, Priam's eldest son. He was noble, disciplined, and beloved by his people. Hector led sorties against the Greek camps, striking swiftly before retreating behind the safety of Troy's walls. Paris, too, fought, though his courage was often questioned, and his victories owed more to Aphrodite's protection than to his own skill. The gods themselves took sides, shaping the course of the war. Hera and Athena favored the Greeks, still angered by Paris's judgment. Aphrodite stood by Paris and Helen, protecting them from harm. Apollo aided the Trojans, while Poseidon lent strength to the Greeks. The battlefield became not only a clash of men, but a stage for divine rivalry. Years passed, and the war dragged on. Neither side could claim victory. The Greeks grew weary, their supplies stretched thin, their warriors restless. The Trojans endured, their city still standing, their spirits lifted by Hector's leadership. Yet beneath the surface, tensions simmered. Pride, anger, and jealousy stirred among the Greek leaders, and soon those rivalries would erupt, changing the course of the war. For now, the early years were marked by raids, skirmishes, and endless waiting. The torch of prophecy burned steadily, and the great duel of destiny had yet to unfold. As the war dragged on, the Greeks grew restless. Their raids on Trojan allies brought spoils, but also tension among the leaders. Pride and honor were fragile things, and in the Greek camp, two men stood at the center of a quarrel that would shake the entire war: Agamemnon, commander of the host, and Achilles, the greatest warrior of Greece. After one such raid, the Greeks divided the prizes of war among themselves. Agamemnon claimed a maiden named Chrysis, but her father, a priest of Apollo, came to ransom her. When Agamemnon refused, Apollo sent a plague upon the Greek army. The soldiers suffered, and the leaders demanded that Agamemnon return the girl to appease the god. Agamemnon, furious at being forced to yield, agreed, but his pride was wounded. To show his authority, he declared that he would take another prize from one of the leaders. His words struck like a blow, and when he seized the maiden Briseis from Achilles, the insult was unbearable. Achilles, enraged, withdrew from battle. He refused to fight, refused to lead his men, and even prayed to his mother, the sea goddess Thetis. to ask Zeus to favor the Trojans so the Greeks would suffer without him. His absence left the army weakened, and the quarrel between the two leaders cast a shadow over the entire alliance. The war continued, but without Achilles, the Greeks struggled. Agamemnon's pride had cost them their greatest warrior, and the tension between king and hero threatened to undo the unity forged by the oath of Tyndareus. Thus, the conflict between Agamemnon and Achilles was not merely a quarrel over spoils. It was a clash of pride, honor, and destiny, a rift that would shape the course of the Trojan War. As the war dragged on, the Greeks and Trojans sought a way to end the conflict without further bloodshed. The armies had clashed, heroes had fought, and yet the city of Troy still stood. To settle matters, a duel was proposed. Paris, who had taken Helen, would face Menelaus, her rightful husband. The outcome would decide her fate and perhaps bring peace. The two armies gathered on the plain before Troy. The Greeks stood in ranks, their armor gleaming, while the Trojans watched from behind their walls. Priam himself came forward to witness the duel, seated high upon the walls, for the contest was not only between two men, but between two nations. Paris stepped forward, handsome and proud, though his courage was often questioned. Menelaus, fierce and determined, burned with anger at the insult done to him. The duel began, and the two warriors clashed with spear and sword. Menelaus fought with fury, striking hard and driving Paris back. At one point, Menelaus seized Paris by the helmet, dragging him toward the Greek lines. Victory seemed certain, and the war might have ended then and there. But the gods were watching. Aphrodite, who had promised Paris the love of Helen, would not allow him to fall. She broke the strap of his helmet, freeing him from Menelaus's grasp, and whisked him away in a mist, carrying him safely back to Helen. The duel ended without resolution. Menelaus raged, denied his victory, while the Trojans murmured uneasily. The gods had intervened, and the war could not be ended by mortal combat alone. Helen remained in Troy, Paris remained alive, and the conflict continued. Thus, the duel between Paris and Menelaus showed the futility of seeking peace, while the gods themselves quarreled. The torch of prophecy burned brighter, and the war pressed onward, its end still far away. Among all the defenders of Troy, none was more noble or beloved than Hector, eldest son of King Priam and Queen Hecuba. Unlike Paris, whose choices had brought Helen to Troy and ignited the war, Hector was a man of duty, honor, and courage. He fought not for personal desire, but for his city, his family, and the people who looked to him for protection. Hector was both warrior and prince, a leader who inspired his soldiers and gave hope to the citizens within the walls. He was known for his strength in battle, his skill with spear and sword, and his unwavering resolve. Yet he was also gentle with his family, devoted to his wife Andromache and their young son As. To them, he was not only a hero, but a husband and father, torn between love and duty. As the war raged, Hector became the heart of Troy's defense. He led his armies against the Greeks, striking fear into their ranks and earning respect even from his enemies. While Achilles sulked in his tent, Hector stood firm, carrying the weight of his city upon his shoulders. But Hector's fate was bound to the prophecy that had haunted Troy since Paris's birth. Though he fought bravely, the gods had already woven his destiny. His courage could delay the fall of Troy, but it could not prevent it. Still, in those years of war, Hector shone as Troy's greatest protector. He was the shield of his people, the pride of his father, and the warrior who stood against the might of Greece. His name would be remembered not only for his battles, but for his honor, a prince who fought for love, for family, and for the city he could not save. The quarrel between Agamemnon and Achilles had left the Greek army weakened. Without their greatest warrior, the Trojans pressed hard against the Greek defenses, and Hector led his forces with relentless courage. The Greeks, weary and desperate, struggled to hold their ground. Among them was Patroclus, the closest companion of Achilles. He was loyal, brave, and deeply troubled by the suffering of the Greek army. Day after day, he watched the Trojans drive the Greeks back toward their ships, and he could no longer bear to see his comrades fall. Patroclus went to Achilles, pleading with him to return to battle. But Achilles, still consumed by anger toward Agamemnon, refused. Instead, he allowed Patroclus to wear his armor and lead the Myrmidons, his warriors, into the fight. Clad in the shining armor of Achilles, Patroclus appeared to the Trojans as if the great hero himself had returned. The sight struck fear into the enemy. The Greeks rallied, their spirits lifted, and the Trojans were driven back from the ships. Patroclus fought with fury, cutting down warriors and scattering the enemy ranks. For a moment, it seemed as though the tide of war had turned, but Patroclus, carried away by the heat of battle, pressed too far. He pursued the Trojans all the way to the walls of Troy, where Hector awaited. The gods, too, intervened, stripping Patroclus of strength and leaving him vulnerable. Hector struck him down, and the man who had fought in Achilles' armor fell upon the battlefield. The death of Patroclus was more than the loss of a warrior. It was the spark that would awaken Achilles from his anger. Grief and rage would soon drive him back into the war, and the clash between Hector and Achilles would become inevitable. The death of Patroclus struck Achilles with grief deeper than any wound. His closest companion had fallen, cut down by Hector, and the sorrow quickly turned to rage. No longer could Achilles remain apart from the war. His anger at Agamemnon was forgotten. His heart burned only with the desire for vengeance. Achilles returned to battle, his armor newly forged by the god Hephaestus, gleaming with divine fire. When he entered the field, the Greeks rejoiced, for their greatest warrior had come back. The Trojans, seeing him, trembled, for they knew that Hector would now face the fury of Achilles. The two armies clashed, but the true battle was between Hector and Achilles. Hector, noble and steadfast, stood before the walls of Troy, knowing his fate was near. His wife Andromache had begged him not to fight, but duty bound him to defend his city. He faced Achilles with courage, though the gods had already decreed the outcome. The duel was fierce. Hector fought bravely, striking with skill, but Achilles was relentless, driven by grief and rage. At last, Achilles pierced Hector with his spear, and the prince of Troy fell upon the battlefield. But Achilles' wrath did not end with Hector's death. In his fury, he tied Hector's body to his chariot and dragged it before the walls of Troy, a cruel act that horrified both Greeks and Trojans. Priam and the people of Troy wept, watching their protector dishonored, while Achilles raged, unable to let go of his grief. The death of Hector was more than the fall of a warrior. It was the breaking of Troy's shield, the loss of its greatest defender. The prophecy moved closer to fulfillment, and though the city still stood, its heart had been struck down. The death of Hector left Troy in mourning. Their greatest defender had fallen, and his body had been dishonored, dragged across the battlefield by Achilles in his fury. Within the city, grief was heavy, and King Priam, aged and sorrowful, could not bear to see his son's body defiled. Guided by courage and by the gods themselves, Priam resolved to do what seemed impossible. He would go alone into the Greek camp, into the tent of Achilles, and beg for the return of Hector's body, with the help of Hermes, who cloaked him in safety. Priam passed through the enemy lines and entered the tent of the man who had slain his son. There the old king knelt before Achilles. He clasped the warrior's hands and spoke words that pierced deeper than any spear. "I have endured what no man on earth has ever endured before. I have kissed the hands of the man who killed my son." Achilles, struck by Priam's grief, felt his own sorrow rise again. He remembered his father, far away in Greece, and the pain of losing Patroclus. In that moment, the rage that had consumed him softened. He saw not an enemy, but a father broken by loss. Moved by compassion, Achilles agreed to return Hector's body. He ordered it to be cleansed and prepared with honor, and he granted the Trojans a truce so they might hold proper funeral rites. Priam returned to Troy with his son's body, and the city mourned. Hector was laid to rest with dignity, and for a brief moment the war paused. The grief of fathers, the sorrow of sons, and the mercy of enemies had brought peace, though only for a time. With Hector gone, the Trojans mourned, but the war did not end. Achilles, though softened by Priam's plea, returned to battle with unmatched fury. His presence struck terror into the Trojans, and his victories piled high. No warrior could stand against him, and the Greeks rejoiced, believing the war might soon be theirs. Yet even the greatest hero cannot escape fate. The gods had long known that Achilles' life would be short, his glory eternal. His mother, Thetis, had warned him, if he fought at Troy, he would win everlasting fame but lose his life. Achilles accepted this destiny, and now the moment approached. Paris, who had once judged the goddesses and carried Helen to Troy, was guided by Apollo in this final act. As Achilles fought near the Sihon gate, Paris loosed an arrow. Apollo guided its flight. The spot untouched by the waters of the Styx when his mother had tried to make him invincible. The arrow pierced, and Achilles fell. The greatest warrior of Greece, the terror of Troy, lay lifeless upon the battlefield. His comrades rushed to protect his body, for even in death, his presence was a prize worth fighting over. The Greeks mourned deeply, for with Achilles gone, their strength was diminished. Yet his name would live forever, sung in poems and remembered in stories. His death was not the end of the war, but it was the turning of its tide. Thus, the prophecy moved closer to fulfillment. The torch of destiny burned on, and though Achilles' flame had been extinguished, the fire of the war raged ever brighter. For 10 long years, the war raged on. The Greeks could not breach the mighty walls of Troy, and the Trojans, though weary, still held firm. Both sides had suffered, heroes had fallen, and yet the city remained unbroken. It seemed as though the war might never end. But among the Greeks was Odysseus, king of Ithaca, famed not only for his courage, but for his cunning mind. Where brute force failed, Odysseus sought a trick, a plan so clever it might succeed where countless battles had not. He proposed building a great wooden horse, towering and hollow within. To the Trojans, it would appear as a gift, an offering to the gods, a symbol of the Greeks' surrender. But hidden inside the horse would be warriors, waiting silently for nightfall. The Greeks set to work, crafting the horse with skill and care. When it was finished, they left it upon the plain before Troy and sailed away, or so it seemed. The Trojans, seeing the empty shore and the strange gift, gathered in wonder. Some warned it was a trick, others believed it a sacred offering. In the end, curiosity and pride won. The horse was dragged through the gates and placed within the city. That night, as Troy slept, the hidden warriors crept out from the horse. They opened the gates, and the Greek army, which had not truly sailed away but waited nearby, poured into the city. The plan had worked. Odysseus's cunning had succeeded where years of battle had failed. The torch of prophecy blazed at last, for Troy's doom had come not by strength of arms, but by the cleverness of a single man. Night fell upon Troy, and with it came the silence of false victory. The Trojans, believing the Greeks had sailed away, celebrated within their walls. The great wooden horse stood in the city, admired as a trophy, a gift to the gods. Songs were sung, wine was poured, and joy filled the streets. Yet beneath that joy, fate waited patiently. When darkness deepened and the city slept, the hidden warriors inside the horse crept out. They moved silently, opening the gates to the Greek army that had returned under cover of night. Soon, the plain outside Troy was alive with soldiers, torches in hand, ready to strike. The Greeks poured into the city. Fire was set to homes and temples, and the proud walls that had stood for generations echoed with cries of terror. The Trojans, startled from sleep, tried to resist, but the attack was overwhelming. Warriors fell, families fled, and the streets ran with chaos. Priam, the aged king, was struck down in his own palace. Andromache wept as Hector's young son Astyanax was torn from her arms, his fate sealed by the cruelty of war. Helen, the cause of it all, watched as her beauty had brought ruin to the city that had sheltered her. The flames rose higher, consuming Troy, the prophecy of Hecuba's dream. The torch that would burn the city had come true. The proud towers crumbled, the people scattered, and the city that had once shone like a jewel was reduced to ashes. Thus ended Troy, not by strength of arms alone, but by deception, by pride, and by destiny. The torch of prophecy had burned to its end, and the story of Troy became legend, carried in song and memory for all time. When the flames consumed Troy and its proud towers crumbled, the war was over, but the story was not. Survivors scattered, carrying with them grief, memories, and the burden of destiny. King Priam was gone, Hector was gone, and many of Troy's noble sons had fallen. Yet some lived to wander. Among them was Aeneas, who, guided by the gods, led a band of survivors away from the burning city. He carried his father upon his shoulders and held his son's hand, a symbol of Troy's spirit enduring even in ruin. His journey would take him far, across seas and lands, to found a new people who would one day rise as Rome. Helen, the woman whose beauty had sparked the war, returned to Sparta with Menelaus. Some say she was welcomed, others that she lived in sorrow, forever marked by the destruction her presence had brought. The Greeks, though victorious, did not escape tragedy. Many who sailed home faced storms, shipwrecks, and the wrath of gods angered by their cruelty. Agamemnon returned to Mycenae only to meet betrayal and death. Odysseus wandered for years upon the sea, his cleverness tested again and again before he could finally return to Ithaca. For Troy, the ashes were all that remained. Yet from those ashes stories grew, tales of heroes, of gods, of love and war. The prophecy had been fulfilled, the torch had burned, and the city was gone. But the memory of Troy lived on, carried in song and legend, whispered through generations. And so, the tale of Troy comes to its end. The battles have ceased, the heroes have fallen, and the survivors have begun their journeys into new destinies. The fire has dimmed, leaving only embers glowing softly in the night. Now, as the story closes, let your eyes grow heavy. The war is over. The city sleeps in memory, and the voices of heroes fade into silence. Rest gently, for the tale has been told, and tomorrow will bring new dreams. Good night.